thinking about these issues, about the experience of literature. However, as I worked on this project, I realized that really I was writing two different books. So I split the work, and in 2004 I published this theoretical book, and I published a book on J.M. Coetzee. So in a way they're sort of twin books. And I was determined to keep this one short and as readable as possible, because I'd had enough of very dense theoretical works that spend a lot of the time analyzing other theories. I didn't want to get into how I was reading Derrida or how I was reading Kant or whatever. So instead I just put a section at the end in which I noted the main debts, that at least as I was aware of them. It did pretty well, constantly being referred to in other works, but still I was quite surprised when in 2017 the publisher Routledge told me they wanted to put it in their Routledge Classics series, which is the one that's available now. So I wrote a new preface. We had a very nice launch event in Edinburgh, which is still available online through the Routledge website, and it still continues to sell and be referenced, which is nice. So I was asking myself, among all the very varied uses of language, what is distinctive about literary language, or even more precisely, what is distinctive about our experience of literary language in contrast to our experience of all the other ways in which language can be used. So the focus was not on all the ways in which language in literature operates, all the things we can get from literature, how literature functions in many different manners in society. It was on what literature can offer that nothing else can. What is the literary in literature? And I suppose, in retrospect, I feel I should have made it clearer that what was attracting my attention was the very powerful experience that literature can offer. It doesn't happen that often. Of course, most of the time we read, we get pleasure, we enjoy the content, we're aware of elegance of style or clever metaphors or whatever it might be, but we don't have a powerful affective stroke cognitive response. My interest was in those moments when literature does, the experience of reading a work of literature or seeing a play or seeing a film, if we want to expand the definition of literature a bit, when it does have that profound effect, which is often a combination of the cognitive and the affective. Those were the moments that I thought needed a better explanation than had been given. Now, I had been reading throughout my career, really, works of theory, literary theory, and philosophy. The two authors who are particularly, the two philosophers who are particularly important here are Derrida, who we talked about yesterday, and someone we haven't mentioned, Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas was not very interested in literature or the arts. He was very much a philosopher of ethics, advancing a rather, I was going to say extreme, but certainly a very powerful view of the ethical relationship, the responsibility of the individual as primary to any philosophy or any activity in the world. For him, ethics, at least his version of ethics, was prior. He called ethics first philosophy. So for him, before you started to use the rational techniques of philosophy, you needed to be aware of your situation as an ethical being with responsibilities to what he called the other, l'autre. the other for Levinas. Levinas was a Jewish thinker, and so for him, the other was a kind of manifestation on earth of the divine. But it's not necessary. It's not necessary to follow him there. His thinking about the other in itself is very powerful and very interesting. So the question I put to myself was, could the literary text be thought of as an other in Levinas's sense? Derrida, incidentally, did a lot of work on Levinas, and it was through Derrida that I discovered Levinas. And in some ways, I'm using a Derridean version of Levinas, which is not about the divine at all. So if the literary text is an other, and it seemed to me that this was a profitable way of thinking about it, because that powerful experience that I was trying to understand seemed to me, still seems to me, to be an experience of something outside our normal frameworks and habits of thought and feeling. When I'm profoundly moved by a work, I'm taken into territory, mental territory, emotional territory that I have not experienced before, that is new to me. And this seems to be true not just of an individual response to literary work, but that the great literary works are capable of having this effect upon large numbers of readers or viewers. So I followed this thought: what kind of other might a literary work be? I should say right away that I tend to prefer the word work. Barthes, you might remember, was keen on the word text because it suggested weaving and surface and so on. And I tend to use the word text for the words on the page or in the ear before you respond to them as literature. But once you're responding to them as literature, I want to say this is a work, because I think we're always aware that it's being created through the work of, through the labor of an artist, a writer in this case. What kind of other then would a work be? And after working on this for some time, it seemed to me we could think of it as having three dimensions, which are all interrelated. And as you'll know if you read the book, they are singularity, and we talked about that yesterday, a kind of uniqueness, but not a uniqueness, a closed uniqueness, rather a uniqueness that's open to change, that's open to new contexts, that absorbs the generality rather than being a kind of nugget of uniqueness. It seemed to me that the word invention, which is the word that Derrida uses in an important essay, was a useful one. Invention as a sense of the act of, the work of bringing this other into being by being inventive. And by being inventive, I meant, I was thinking of an artist, a writer, responding to his or her context, becoming aware of ways in which habitual ways of thinking didn't work, things that were being marginalized or suppressed by the culture, finding cracks, fissures, tensions, and using those as ways to open the culture to new opportunities, new horizons. So singularity and inventiveness, which I contrasted with originality, which is simply a historical phenomenon. Certain things are original. Remember, I told you yesterday about Kant's exemplary originality, so a specific kind of originality. But inventiveness, for me, is something, it's not a historical fact about a work. Work probably was original in its time, but the puzzle, if you like, about inventiveness is that we still feel it today, even of works hundreds of years ago. So I can still feel the inventiveness in a Sophocles play, even if I don't know the historical context and all the other things that he was reacting to. inventiveness is a characteristic of the work. And finally, alterity, which is a fancy word for otherness. So those three, singularity, inventiveness, and alterity, seem to me to characterize the work as other. So then the question is, what is the reader's responsibility? Picking up Levinas's idea, if the reader has responsibilities, what is the responsibility in doing justice, as we often say, which is an ethical phrase, doing justice to the work as a reader or as a critic? And clearly it's to do justice to those three things, to the work's singularity, to its inventiveness, to its otherness. We talked yesterday about Derrida's notion of the signature and counter-signature, which is something that I picked up and used. And like Derrida, I felt there was a paradox. I feel there's a paradox there in producing a counter-signature to a signature, in that you both have to be faithful to the work, and yet you have to be unfaithful. You're not simply repeating what the work says, you're bringing your own inventive and hopefully singular and to the world new sense of the work's achievement. So it's a strange combination of fidelity and infidelity. But one more thing struck me, that the literary work, if we're thinking of it in terms of an experience, is not an object. It's not a thing that you can put down and, look at the words on the page and treat it as an object. It's an event. It's something that happens. The text, the words on the page, become literature in the event of my reading or hearing it read. So the literary work is always new, because it's always an event that is at least a little bit different from the previous event. Even if I'm reading it for a second time, it's not going to be quite the same, because the context has changed, I have changed. So the reader is experiencing the work as an event that opens into new domains, into new territories, into unfathomed zones of feeling and thought. As a result of which, I argue that any powerful reading, any powerful experience of a literary work leaves the reader changed. It must do, because the reader's been taken into some unfathomed territory. It might not be a permanent change, but it at least temporarily brings about some kind of change. But it's not, and this is something that a lot of people would have disagreed with, it's not a change that could have been predicted, precisely because alterity, the other, is the unknown. It's that which has not been, the culture has not been able to see it or to state it, and the artist has made it possible for the first time for that zone to become visible or audible. And therefore, it's not something that you could say in advance, oh yes, reading this work will produce this effect. So at the beginning of the book, I set my face against instrumental uses of literature. Not that these are to be condemned. Literature is always being used instrumentally, that's to say, for a set purpose. So you can use literature as propaganda in order to advance a cause, in order to convey information about a historical period or about a moral idea. All sorts of things literature can do instrumentally, as a useful instrument, as a tool. But when it's being read as literature, I would claim it can't be instrumentalized because of the uncertainty. Now, usually it'll be a beneficial change. It doesn't mean to say it's guaranteed. Literature can do you harm. If it's a powerful way of introducing you to things you hadn't thought of or felt before, you might be worse off afterwards. But the openness to the new is an ethical good. And a society which recognizes that and which accepts that and which values cultural artifacts which allow that to happen is a society that, in my view, is ethically sound. So the very openness to the inventiveness of the artwork is itself an ethical good. Many other features of the argument that are in the book you would have seen. I think, did I mention? No, maybe it was only talking to somebody yesterday. The idea of authoredness. I just wanted to turn to suggest that we do always think of a work as the work of somebody or some group. If it's a film, of course, we don't think of it as the work of a single person, but it does have. It's the product of work, which makes it different from the beautiful flower. You might say it's the work of God, but that's a bit different. The work of art definitely feels like, and we experience it as the work of an author. But I won't go into any of the other things, but you can very welcome to ask questions about other points that the book makes. I just want to give you the opportunity to have a good discussion about these arguments and about at least two things. One, can we, if there's any validity in this way of thinking, can it be extended to other types of art? Is it possible to talk about a piece of music or a painting in similar terms, alterity, inventiveness, singularity, and so on? So that's one big question. Another big question, for me it's a related one, because I was doing some work recently on a painting, on the question of painting, looking at a particular example, and it struck me that we're much more likely in talking about a work of visual art to be aware of the skill with which the artist has worked, or the craft that the work embodies. Now, this is not a distinctive thing about artworks. We can find examples of skilled craftsmanship in many places that we wouldn't think of as art, at least not art in this very maybe refined sense of something that can give you this powerful experience. But plenty of textiles or decorative panels in a building, or the skilled workmanship is we can enjoy it in many places. So it's not a distinctive feature of the artwork. However, we need to take into account somehow. So that's the question that I've been asking myself: how does it enter into this picture of how art works? One of the most important attempts to distinguish between craft and art in the fullest sense was made by R.G. Collingwood, a British philosopher, earlier the previous century. One of his claims, which I think is an interesting one, although it's in terms of the artist rather than the viewer or the reader, is that a work of craft is produced with a plan in advance. The worker in a craft knows exactly what he or she is aiming to produce and then gets on and does it, whereas the artist doesn't. The artist begins uncertain of the final product, and it only emerges in the act of making. And I think that's interesting, because that's what I call inventiveness. It's going over a threshold that one didn't know even perhaps was there into a new zone. And if the artist does it, so I think does the receiver. And then there are the other questions that I raised at the beginning. What about popular culture? Are there ways in which we enjoy popular music, genre fiction, detective fiction, science fiction that isn't trying to break any bounds of that genre? What are we going to say about popular culture? And another huge question, which I don't know the answer to, but you might be able to help me. How much is my way of thinking here dependent on the culture of Western Europe, basically the Greco-Roman culture, which then expands through Europe and the British colonies. Obviously, there are ancient, rich cultures elsewhere in the world, including India, that may well not function in this way, that the experience of something akin to Western art may actually be different. So those are some of the questions, but we've got, when do we finish? We've got an hour. Let's see if we can make some, not necessarily make progress, but at least air some of these issues. So over to you.
So what are the qualities that an author should possess to produce high quality literary work? Is it important, or how important is it to understand theology, philosophy and psychology?
Is it important to understand theology, philosophy and psychology in order to do justice to a writer? No, because I think any knowledge that you possess can be useful in responding to a work of art. And we were saying yesterday, I think, that knowledge of the context in which the work was produced, so historical knowledge there, can be useful. But I think I would say that most works that have that powerful effect do it without needing any kind of theoretical knowledge, that they speak more directly than that. That an artist who produces a work which the audience can't appreciate without having access to some body of theoretical knowledge is not going to be a very successful artist. Can you think of examples, though, of where you would need to know psychology or theology? I suppose theology, you might say to read Dante, you do need to know something about medieval theology. On the other hand, you might say, no, Dante gives you a great deal in the poem, in the Divine Comedy, so you don't really need to go outside because it's all in there. What do you think? Yes. Or anybody?
I have a question. First part of the book, there is this mentioning of originality versus creativity.
Yeah.
Talked about. So you say that an original work may not be creative, or a creative work may not be necessarily original.
Yeah.
So what does this? There is a narrow line between this original and creative. So how do you actually define this two?
Okay, yeah. There's actually three terms that I use: creative, creation, originality, and invention or inventiveness. And this is not how these words are generally used, although I think I'm picking up on some of the senses, but it is my own attempt to clarify a rather murky area. So for me, creativity, creation of something, is an individual, personal activity. And children can be very creative, partly because they haven't yet absorbed all the information. They're not weighed down by knowledge and the fact that millions of other people have created stuff. So creativity is simply bringing into being something new for that person. I get some clay and I create a pot. And for me, it's the first time I've ever made a pot. I'm being creative, but it's like a million other pots. Originality is not an individual thing, but a cultural thing. So within a given culture, and I know this is a vague term because how broad is a culture? Are we talking about the culture of a nation state, a culture of the West, a culture of a city? There are lots of questions there, but let's leave it vague for the moment. Somebody creates a work which is new, not just for that person, but for that culture. So it might be that this clay vessel has a shape and a texture and a color which makes it different from all the clay vessels that have been produced in previous centuries in this imaginary culture. So it's original, and we can tell it's original if we do historical work. So I study the remaining clay pots from this culture, and I see that here's one which I can date, and I can see that it's the first one, and it's different from all the ones that have been found from an earlier date. It's always obviously subject to revision. You know, the archaeologist might find a new hoard of clay pots and say, no, so it wasn't that one that was original. That one was actually copying an earlier one, which was the original one. So it's a historical fact about a work appearing within a culture. But inventiveness, which is the much more problematic term, would be if we now go to a museum and there's a series of clay pots in a glass case, and this one gives us a real sense of power and beauty, and we're just stunned by it. We think, my God, this is just encapsulation of something remarkable. And from then on, we never see clay pots in quite the same way. That is, for me, inventiveness, because the artist brought something into being that remains capable, centuries later, of giving me the experience of art. So inventiveness is a paradoxical thing. I mean, how is it possible for the creativity of the individual to become something that can leap over history, can leap over centuries? It may just be coincidence. It may be that my own or my culture's own way of responding to artifacts is at a point where this one happens to really speak to the individuals in that culture. Or it may be that there's a whole historical sequence which ties an earlier work to the present. There's a line that I quote in the book from F.R. Leavis, who's English critic, was reviewing an early anthology of Renaissance poetry, and he says you go through the poems of various writers in the late 16th century, and you read them with pleasure. They're interesting. They give you an insight into the poetry of the time. And then suddenly you reach John Donne. I suppose what you're controlling is your own prejudices and your own. The key thing is not to be imposing your own ideas and ways of thinking and feeling on the work, but allowing the work to speak to you. So not controlling the work, but maybe controlling your own tendency, because we're all naturally inclined to take the easy route and to just find in what we're reading or seeing what we expect to read or find. And it's quite hard sometimes being able to let a work that's challenging those ideas, let it speak. So it's very much about allowing rather than controlling.
Is it related to what you were saying yesterday about resisting the temptation to move from the signifier to the signifier?
Yeah, absolutely. The easy way of reading a literary work is to simply read it in terms of content, as if it were a historical account or a journalistic account, just telling you what happened. And of course, some novelists, particularly in the 20th and 21st century, make that difficult because the style, the language intervenes and doesn't present itself as a window through to reality. But the great Victorian novels, for instance, many of them you can read, or Tolstoy's War and Peace. You can read as a account of things that really happened. Of course, most of them didn't really happen. He made them up, but to read it as literature is to resist the urge simply to read the content, and to be open to what Tolstoy is doing in terms of the genre of the novel, and in terms of the exploration of human character and the depiction of human character, the notion of history, and what it is to be putting into verbal terms historical events like battles. All sorts of things are going on in War and Peace that enable you to, at least if you're not taking the easiest way of reading, enable you to enjoy and be moved by and to be affected by the work. I mean, let me stress again, because my interest was in the distinctiveness of what literature has to offer, I'm not saying there's something wrong with reading in that way. I mean, War and Peace is fascinating for all that historical detail, and Tolstoy obviously did a lot of work reading about the Napoleonic campaign in Russia. But you could get that also from a sheer history. If you're going to read it as literature, it's more than just telling you the story of what happened, or what you imagine could have happened in these fictional characters. Does that help?
So certain books, certain inventive literature as you define it, can offer a reader who's a responsible reader who comes in with a suspension of reference in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Only certain books can work in conjunction with a reader who reads a text like that. It's not that all literature can do the work of being open to alterity, to inventiveness. And also I was thinking about how this reading, such as the reading of Henry James' The Golden Rule by Miss Baum, and she talks about how it works as a improving of your moral imagination. But someone could read the same book and say, oh, it's a book about gossip.
Mm-hmm.
But even Nussbaum's reading, in my very humble opinion, is a sort of close-ended reading, because she instrumentalizes the book to serve some sort of moral end. So in looking at what you have done, which is that the work of the reader should also be one which is to have an open-ended reading of a book and to leave space for ambiguity. How does one, I mean, from your own experience of reading a text, like how could you illustrate like how you've sort of done that? I'm not asking for a method, but
No.
because that would go against everything that you said.
Exactly.
But, is there some experience that you had where you found yourself falling into a sort of bias and held yourself back from that? Do you have any sort of
Okay, I mean, you started by making the point that not all literary works offer that experience, and of course, one of the problems is the word literature itself, because I think I say in the book, it can be used for any writing that's fictional or imaginative. It belongs to any of the familiar genres, and clearly most of that writing is not what we're talking about here. So there's literature A, a certain kind of writing, and there's literature B, a certain kind of writing that is capable of producing the most powerful effects. The literature as art. So again, there's nothing to be condemnatory about in the wider definition of literature. These are pleasures we all have, and a work that seems to belong to that category can, partly perhaps through the work of critics, can be shown to actually have more power. I'm thinking, for instance, of the films of Douglas Sirk, which came out as kind of big Hollywood romances, and I think the early viewers just absorbed them in the way of many other Hollywood romances, but film critics subsequently began to find ways of responding to Sirk that turned them into much more powerful films, much more original, but also even inventive, and doing very interesting things with the genre. So that's that question. Now, you want me to give you an example?
Yeah, just
of
example of your own experience of reading a work, and possibly rereading something and then coming to possibly dismiss your earlier opinion of a certain work.
Yeah, I'm sure it's happened.
Can I turn it back on the class, because they all read the lady with the laptop.
Okay.
And we, and there was some, you could have moral readings of that in different ways. And yet, there was a lot of disagreement about what the ending made you feel or think. Yeah? And doesn't that illustrate very well what I'm talking about here? About the open-endedness of, but it was a powerful story because it wasn't closed down as it was at the end. You agree? Right, there we go. So we'll just, they've experienced this already.
Good. That's not the kind of example that you're looking for, though. You're looking for something that...
Some change.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to think.
From the perspective of the reader.
Yeah. I mean, the question might be, why would you have a newly sharpened sense of the value or the power of a work? It might be because you've grown older, I suppose, and you've had more experience, and something that when you were young seemed fairly trivial, you realize later it has much more to offer. Or it could be because you've read, as in the case of Sirk, I think, you've read some critic who's made it come alive for you. I mean, one of the important functions of criticism is to enable other readers to enjoy to the maximum and be changed by works that would otherwise maybe just be read in a casual way. I can't think of any specific examples in my own career. I'm sure there are. Certainly, I've had the experience of reading works, 40 years apart, and finding them very different. I wouldn't say that they were once not very exciting and then later they became more rewarding, but certainly they read differently. And the reverse, of course, can happen. I can reread something I read as an adolescent and think, oh my God, how did that speak to me? So there's a constant change. Yes, I agree with you about Nussbaum, by the way. Fair enough, I suppose. You can use fiction as she could be talking about a historical account, showing moral dilemmas and so on. It doesn't have to be. She's not really talking about literature. But let's try and separate the different domains of questioning here. Let's keep with the arguments of the singularity of literature for a bit, but then I want to talk about these other issues, the question of non-literary art and popular culture and Western culture. But are there any more questions to do with the arguments I've been presenting? Just clarification or disagreement or extension, anything?
Can I ask a question then? No one else wants one?
I suppose, yes.
Go on. It's just, I'm not sure it's even an interesting question, but is there a difference? I mean, maybe it's not one you've thought about, whether there's a difference between scientific invention and literary invention? I mean, because when I was reading, you talking about creativity, it made me think of Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shifts. Is it comparable? Is that where science gets creative?
Yeah, no, it is a very good question, and I suppose that you. I mean, it's as I said, it's Derrida uses the word invention in a wonderful essay that I included in the anthology that I produced of his work, and he's certainly not just talking about artistic invention. He's talking about what it means to invent, to bring into being the other. It is about alterity and how that comes into being. I've taken that further in arguing that inventiveness, it may be implicit in the Derrida, but it doesn't quite say it like this. Inventiveness in art has this capacity to be reanimated in later ages. A scientific invention, or an engineering invention, once it's done, and you can look back on it. I don't know, I can't remember if it's in the book or not now, but I remember visiting the Greenwich Observatory in London, and they have one of what's his name? I had his name a moment ago. Thomas, famous clockmaker whose invention of very precise clocks actually made navigation, ship navigation possible. So here's this beautiful object. There's this clock with a pendulum keeping time still. And my response to it was pretty strong, It was almost an aesthetic, there wasn't an aesthetic dimension, but that was to the craft, the skill, the beauty of the cogs and so on. But as an instrument that changed the capacity of human beings to travel around the globe, it had a strong impact on me. So you could say the inventiveness survives, that I'm still responding to the inventiveness. So I was asking myself, is that like reading a poem by George Herbert and feeling, wow, this still carries an immense charge for me. This takes me into places I haven't been before. And I don't think it is. I think it's different. I think the appreciation of the inventiveness of some engineer or scientist working in the past is different from the inventiveness that survives or that comes alive again in a work of art. I don't know. What do you think?
Because you're not involved in the process of creation, in the sense that when you read a work of literature, you're involved in creating it.
That's a nice point. Yeah. You become the author in a kind of way, but you don't become the author of a complicated clock. Yeah. Or if you read, Newton's Principia Mathematica, not that I've read it, but I know it's there. I could read it. And it's an immensely inventive bit of mathematical thinking. But you don't become a mathematician when you read it, at least, unless you already are one, perhaps. Yeah. So I think I probably would want to make that distinction, that art is there's something very remarkable, and no one has quite, to my satisfaction, given an answer as to how that happens, how you can feel inventiveness, how you can read Donne as if he were a living poet. Well, we can always come back to the book, but can we think a bit about other arts? I mean, let's think about visual art. Pavel, were you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can say something on it. So, considering other types of art.
Sorry, considering?
Other types of art.
Other types, yeah.
So, I thought of music, and music is definitely works in the same way as literature for me, because inventiveness of music is a lot of course, about technique, usage of instruments, tools, and so on, as well as in literature offers use words, sentences, so on the constructions, the same ways. And in the same way, I know it because I'm aware of how some musicians, composers work. They have a general idea what they want to create, how many tacts, how many like symbols probably they want to use, what the length will be. But as soon as they start, they just add mostly random sounds, and from day to day they add something, change it, and this is where this inventiveness appears. This is from the side of the author.
Yeah.
And from the side of the listener, of course, it works in the same way. So I used to listen to classical music in my childhood a lot. And in my childhood it sounded like more, because children are very creative, children like to listen to some stories in music. So in childhood, mostly when I listen to classical music, I listen to these stories, to this like I try to see pictures in this. But I got older when I started recognizing some musical theories within this frame of classical music. Then the whole my perception changed. Of course, I still was able to recall my experience of childhood, and it affected me. But at the same time, I perceived it as a masterpiece of technique, as a masterpiece of musical advancement. And yes, from the side of the listener, it is inventiveness as well. So in music, I think it works absolutely in the same way. For visual arts, it works a bit different. Not probably from the side of audience, but from the side of authors. So most of authors, they have this project of an art, even in modern art, even in abstractionism, cubism, and all these arts of the beginning of 20th century. So I will not speak about the most recent art because I'm not that aware with. So, but if we speak about the beginning of 20th century, 19th century, yeah, most of artists, painters, they had projects, and mostly they followed their projects, and technique played even bigger role than music's and literature and visual arts. This is why I think that in visual arts the inclination, tendency to understanding technique and tools is a bit more important from the point of the author and even the audience. And this is a slight difference. But in general, we still can apply the concept of inventiveness to this sort of work as well. Because when I read Singularity of Literature, yes, in my mind, I repeatedly applied these concepts, and most of these concepts, including resonance, creativity, inventiveness, I applied them to different parts all the time.
All right, good. Well, that was, as I was writing it, I kept thinking about would this be true of music or visual arts? Yeah, your description of, sorry, I'll come back to you. Your description of the way in which a musician, a composer would work, I think is a good illustration of what Collingwood says, about the difference between craft and art. The craft, you know exactly what it is that you're going to make. Art, you don't really know. You can only discover in the act of. And it would be the same for visual arts, wouldn't it? You have a canvas maybe, and you have an idea of but as once you put down one stroke, of course, that's going to affect the the next one and the next one and the next one, and you may, if it's a, you know, if it's oils and you can overpaint, you could do as X-rays often show now of masterpieces, of how they've been changed over and over again in the course of the painting. So I think it's true of both, but you know, it's perhaps a bit trickier when we talk about the hearer or the viewer. Did you want to come in there?
I just wanted to add some things which Pavel said, but in this case also maybe some issue really matter the time limit in kind of music, literature, theater, and so on. In this kind of art, we can see the time limit, and we can see the story, the beginning, the middle, and conclusion. And if we will look at the art, the drawing, we have no these time limits, and we can over and over again come back to these pictures, and it also makes an importance for viewer about draw their attention. And if you want to come back to music, you have to listen from the beginning again.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, part of that, one implication of the question is, how do you, if you think of the work of art as an event, you know, clearly a work of literature, even though it's on pages, you read it and it's an event of reading, and sculpture or painting or photograph is different. How is it an event to respond to a work of visual art? What do you think? Is it? Could you still think of it as an event? I mean, it doesn't have that temporal quality. Do you? I suppose the question would be, experience a visual object, work of art, in a timeless instant? Is it just bang, you responded to it, or does it have a temporal span? Do you start maybe by taking the whole thing in and then noticing a detail? Yeah.
In continuing with your idea, if there's kind of art like sculpture or painting, has any other inclusion of music, or it makes like a performance, beginning to be a performance.
Then it's a performance, yeah.
We can experience it like an event.
Yeah.
So this is like a mix between different kinds of.
Yeah, you could have a musical work at the same time, but I would argue that even just a painting is an event. The experience of a painting is an event. What's different when you compare a work of music or a work of literature to a painting or a sculpture, well, let's leave sculpture because that's different. A flat painting is that the viewer can choose the sequence. Okay, music, it's given to you, at least most works of music. They're not always written like that. Contemporary music might be written in a different way, so that the performer can decide the sequence, but for the listener, the sequence is just something that comes in. And similarly, reading, you can jump around if you like, or you can, there have been novels produced in boxes where you can choose your own way of reading through, but the norm is that it's given to you. With a painting, or if you think about a sculpture, where you have to actually walk around it or move and get a different sense of it from a different perspective, you choose. You're free to choose how this event will unfold, and it could be a very rapid event. It could be, although you probably wouldn't be able to experience it powerfully as art, but you can spend 10 minutes in front of a painting, and those 10 minutes aren't just all one thing. There'll be 10 minutes taking in different things, noticing the colors, noticing the details in this corner, the detail in that corner, maybe reflecting on the painting's relationship to other paintings you've seen.